Okay, so today we are going to start looking at biomes. And today we're focusing on terrestrial biomes. And so for right now, you're going to need to take out your biomes chart so you can write down all that information. Okay, let's start with what a biome actually is. So we've talked about communities and ecosystems. So a biome is basically a group of ecosystems that share physical as well as living conditions that are the same. So they're large regions characterized by specific types of climate and specific types of organisms. And when we look at biomes, we're really describing them by their vegetation. We don't normally describe them based on the presence of certain animals, and that's just because plant species determine which animal species are present. So plants have adaptations that allow them to live in specific climate conditions, and so that's what kind of defines that biome. And for example, the shape of a plant is usually determined by the climate conditions. So when we talked about evergreens, we said that they had needles and very waxy cuticles on the outside. So those evergreens usually live in a condition that has some cold temperatures and often have snow. So they're adapted for that environment. Okay, so biomes are very closely linked to climate, which in this case, when we say climate, we're talking about weather conditions. So the climate determines what plants are present, and it's based on two important factors: temperature and precipitation. Most organisms can only live within a certain temperature range, so outside of that, they can't survive. So that's why that's important. And then precipitation, larger specimens require larger amounts of water to live and to grow. So certain biomes are going to have very small plants because they don't have a lot of precipitation. Okay, so when we are looking at the various types of biomes, we can see that, for instance, some biomes, such as a rainforest, and this will be something that's familiar to you, is in hot conditions with a lot of precipitation, as opposed to a tundra that's in very cold conditions and it's very dry. And there are things all in between. We have very hot and dry, which makes up a tropical desert. And so we can see based on the temperature and the precipitation that it defines the type of biome that is present. So this is just looking at our biomes across the world, and the climate is the major factor affecting which biomes are present. And climate varies based on two things. It's based on latitude and altitude. So biome distribution is based on those two things. So your textbook does a good job explaining like solar effects and stuff like that. So I'm not going to quite go into all that. But some of the essence of what you need to understand is that obviously further away from the equator, the cooler it is. So, so that's where our temperatures come into effect. And oftentimes, if we're looking at the globe like this, we'll see certain biomes repeat themselves a certain amount of latitude above the equator, as well as similarly those latitudes below the equator. But the another varying factor in that is the altitude, because it can be nice and warm in certain areas that are closer to the equator, but if you go up a mountainside really high, it's going to get cooler even though you're still at the equator. So latitude and altitude both affect the biome distribution. And this is just another example to show you that latitudinal position affects wind patterns, temperature, daylight hours, that sort of thing. So all those have an effect on what plant species are present and therefore what biome is present. So just to kind of hammer home how altitude and latitude both affect our biomes, temperature changes and oxygen levels, as well as sunlight angles and hours of daylight, will change with both latitude and altitude. So if we're looking here, we can see that as we increase in altitude, we get cooler and cooler and often drier. And also as we increase in latitude, the same thing happens. Okay, so we are going to look at terrestrial biomes today. We're going to save aquatic biomes for the next lecture. But the terrestrial biomes fall into 4 major categories. That's the tundra, forests, grasslands, and deserts. And within those, there is some breakdown into more specific regions. So if you'll pull out your chart, this is kind of going to be like a passport through the world. So you can get ideas as to where you might want to visit. That's one of the exciting things to me about biomes, is looking at them going, ooh, I want to see that. So if you think of it like we are tour guiding across the world. Let's get started. Okay, to begin with, we're going to look at the tundra. So these are very cold areas. So these are in the polar regions above 60 degrees north. They have small amounts of precipitation, which is almost always in the form of snow. So they have long, harsh winters with a very short, mild summer. And their growing season is very short, less than 4 months. So again, that determines what kind of plants can be present. And they have nutrient-poor soil. And in this region, they have permafrost. So the soil that they do have, a lot of it is completely frozen year-round. So the species diversity is very low. And if you remember when we talked about species diversity, that means if there's a major catastrophe, these tundra areas have a hard time actually recovering from those catastrophes. So I think it's cool, the tundra biome, that word comes from a Finnish word, tunturi, which means treeless plain. It's one of the coldest of all the biomes, so it has no trees. And remember, we talked about how various plants are adapted to different things. You would have to have very shallow roots in a tundra because of the permafrost. And remember, we said the larger the organism, the more water it requires to grow. So a large tree is not going to be present in the tundra for at least those 2 reasons. It doesn't have enough water, and it also can't penetrate the permafrost, so it doesn't have a good anchor system. So this is a treeless plain. And they're found in the Arctic regions, so and then also on the very tops of mountains. I had the benefit of going to see a tundra area, and that's in Rocky Mountain National Park. If you haven't been there yet, it's in Colorado. I had the chance to go there one time, and it was so beautiful, and partly to me because I'd never seen a tundra before, so it was really, really cool. But there are 2 different types of tundras. One is the alpine and one is the Arctic, and that's based upon alpine tundra is because of altitude, so very high up on a mountain. That's the kind that I saw in Colorado. And then the latitude tundra is the Arctic tundra, and that would be those in the polar regions. So here on this map you can see where most of the Arctic tundra is located, all way up there in that polar region. And just a tundra is extremely dry. During the summer, small amounts of that permafrost do melt and you wind up with bogs. So just kind of very mushy, small, almost pond type areas. So our plant adaptations in the tundra area are low growing, they have shallow root systems, and they have quick reproductive cycles because that growing time is so short. The animal adaptations, those that are present, which isn't a ton, is that they either migrate into the area so they aren't there full time, or they tend to be burrowing animals, those that can stay underground, which is a little bit warmer sometimes. So if you keep in mind, it's very windy in the tundra because there's no wind screens. Usually wind screens are created by trees, so without those trees there's a lot of wind. So mammals and birds are present, and then some insects during the summer, but there are no amphibians and no reptiles, which makes sense, right? Because those are ectothermic, and it would be very hard for them to maintain a decent body temperature. Our muskox here, that's sort of the representative of the tundra, and note that they have a very thick coat of fur, and they have very short, squatty bodies to conserve heat. So their body stays close to the ground, that hair, long coat stays over them and down to the ground as well, keeping all that heat in. Okay, here is our alpine tundra. This is what I was telling you about in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. Again, same thing, very short bushes. The sign over here on the right was actually an approach to Rocky Mountain National Park, so that's actually not in the tundra. That's before you get there. So it's just kind of letting you know what's coming up. Here it is. This is Rocky Mountain National Park. These are pictures actually that I took. So this over here on the left, this right here is my youngest daughter. Just to give you a perspective of how big this area is. Note that there are no trees, just lots of very tiny, tiny little plants. And to the right we have elk that migrate in. They don't live there full time. I guess in this case, people would also be considered migratory animals. Okay, so we talked about our tundra. Wonder if any of you guys really want to go there. I loved it. I would definitely visit there again. Next we're going to move into forests, and there are 4 different types of forests we're going to talk about. One is the taiga, which is also called a coniferous forest. Oh my gosh, y'all, I say that all the time. It's not carnivores, coniferous, so our conifers. And then our temperate deciduous forest, our temperate rainforest, and our tropical rainforest. So let's start with our taiga. This is our northern coniferous forest, and this I'm trying to make sure that you guys see this every time with each of our little areas, as we're looking at average temperature and average rainfall. So this is in this area right here. Remember, our tundra was down here, so we're moving kind of towards the left. So our conifers are present, obviously, in our taiga, and moose tends to be one of those animals that's present quite a bit. Moose is probably my favorite animal, so I had to make sure I included that in here. So its location is around 50 degrees north. And we get a little bit more rainfall than we did in the tundra, but still not a ton. It does have warm summers, still has cold, harsh winters, and their growing season is a little bit longer than the tundra, so about 6 months, which isn't too bad. The soil quality is still fairly poor. It's very acidic, which you would expect from having conifers. Those needles drop. It's a very acidic type of plant. So the taiga is dominated by conifers. And just for another frame of reference, it's also called a boreal forest, so if you've heard that, this is what it's referring to. And there you go. This is where it's located. Just so if you look above the U.S., you can see that a lot of Canada is covered by taiga. So similar to the tundra, the taiga has low species diversity. So that means that it can be decimated when a disease comes in. So often conifers can be affected by wood boring diseases or blights, and so it looks like this. You can see all the defoliated trees, those are dead trees, when you don't have that many species diversity, the whole entire forest can be wiped out. And once that occurs, then we start looking at succession. Secondary succession, by the way, because we already have soil present. So that is sort of the downside of taiga. Okay, because of altitude, we also have what's called montane coniferous forests. And that just means as we go up the mountain, just like we did with our alpine tundra, we have montane, meaning mountain, taigas or mountain coniferous forests. And we see that right here, right below our tundra. So it has less soil and less nutrients as you go up, so obviously less plants, less diversity of plants, slightly lower oxygen, and of course lower temperatures. One thing we haven't mentioned is that as we go up, these UV rays that they're exposed to more and more limits plant growth. So that's something we haven't mentioned yet. Okay, so our coniferous forests are going to be around 3,000 meters off of sea level. And just for comparison's sake, we have looked at our tundra is going to be about here because we're losing our trees and coming up into where there's no trees. That's the tundra area. And then we have glaciers, and then just for comparison purposes, Mount Everest is way up here at 8840. You'll learn that I have a fascination with Mount Everest, so just so you know, I always like to compare it to Mount Everest so you just have a point of reference. Okay, here are some of the animals that are present in the taiga coniferous forest. Typically mammals are adapted with a very high fat content. You guys are familiar with that with bears and probably moose and elk too. They have a very high fat content. And then the birds are adapted for opening seeds of conifers, so their beak is unique because they live in this area where we have conifer cones and seeds. So okay, next we're going to visit the temperate deciduous forest. That's located between 30 and 50 degrees north. We have quite a decent amount of rainfall, and we have warm to hot summers and cool to cold winters. When we say temperate, that usually means in the middle, and that's exactly what it means for all these conditions. We have sort of average rainfall, average temperatures. Our growing season is 4 to 6 months. Now we finally hit a place where we have very rich soil, and that's mostly because now we have deciduous trees, so they will drop their leaves and all that nutrient can go into the soil, so we have rich soil. There's good species diversity. We have insects, mammals, and birds like we've had before, but now we also introduce amphibians and reptiles in some of these warmer forests. So here's the distribution of our temperate deciduous forest, and this should look very familiar to you because basically our forests are temperate deciduous forests, see all throughout the southeast of the US. It's also in parts of Europe and parts of Asia and New Zealand. When you did your walk through Eno River State Park, you were walking through a temperate deciduous forest. So this is what it looks like. That should look very familiar to you. And like we said, temperate tends to be, you know, the very middle of everything. So right here on our graph, let me see if I can get my little, oh, sorry. Yes, so right here, it's in the middle. Average temperature, average precipitation. So here are just some characteristics. Obviously we have lots of green life, plenty of animals, lots of water sources. We have flat wooded areas as well as mountainous wooded areas, and the forests are very shady and damp. Anytime, if you've camped out in our temperate deciduous forest, you know that you can get kind of dewy. That's just a part of being in this area. For your chart, there's no specific plant and animal adaptations because there's no harsh environment to adapt to, but each animal has its own adaptations to its own niche. So it would be difficult to fill in for a chart exactly what those adaptations are because they vary so much. Okay, our forest biomes. Next, we're talking about the temperate rainforest. So temperate, remember, meant average. So these are located in North America, specifically in California and Oregon, also in Australia and New Zealand. And if you note, the precipitation is very large. That's why it's called a rainforest, right? But it still has moderate temperatures. This isn't super hot. And the growing season is 6 to 9 months, which is a really long time because it rarely freezes. And again, because we have deciduous trees, we have nutrient-rich soil. So this includes the redwood forests on the west coast of the U.S. And if you'll remember, we said the largest organisms require the largest amount of water. So that's why we're going to find those in our rainforests. There's rich biodiversity in that as well. Now, I have to say, I have never been there. I've never seen the big redwoods. I would love to at some point in time. So as we're going through all these biomes, this would be on my list of things that I really want to go see. Okay, so here is the distribution. It almost looks kind of niche-like, because if you'll notice, it's on this west coast here of Oregon and Washington and Canada and Alaska. Have you ever heard that Alaska is a rainforest? It definitely is. I had a friend that guided in Alaska, and she would say that. She said people always come not realizing how much rain you get in Alaska, but it is definitely a rainforest. And again, looking at our chart over here, our temperatures are not harsh, but we have a lot of water. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our tropical rainforests. And just as you might guess, our tropical rainforests occur closest to the equator. North and south of it, of course. So all along this region is where we're going to find our tropical rainforests. So our precipitation, again, is large. That's why it's called a rainforest. The growing season is year-round. Because it's tropical, our temperature is very warm. But here's the difference between our tropical rainforest and our temperate rainforest. The quality of the soil is very poor. You wouldn't expect that because there's so many plants in a tropical rainforest. Sorry about all this coughing. But the quality is poor because, quality of the soil is poor because there's so much water. And when we looked at the different soil types, there's a lot of sandy soil in this area. So the water just leaches out all of that nutrients. So it's not really available very much for the plants that grow there. So the soil quality is very poor. A lot of the plant adaptations that we see are root buttresses, which, remember, when we looked at roots, we looked at those supportive type structures. And so those are used to support the tall trees because they're shallow root systems. And again, as we look at our graph over here, we have very high precipitation rates as well as very warm temperatures. So in our tropical rainforest, we have enormous amounts of species diversity. That's why there's such a big fuss made over tropical rainforests and making sure that we don't lose too many of them. Obviously, there's going to be lots of animals, everything from mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects, lots of insects, which, to be honest, is probably why I don't jump and say, whoo, I really want to go see that. But most species that live in a tropical rainforest live in the trees. They live in the canopy. And the threats to tropical rainforests are things like logging and clearing through slash and burn types of farming. So that's something that we need to be able to manage. So let's just look at these layers in a rainforest. Because remember, we said most animals are adapted to live in the trees, and that's even true of some of the plants. A lot of times we have aerial plants in our tropical rainforest. So when we're looking at the different layers, there's the understory. That's the part that's closest to the ground. And oftentimes in the rainforest, there really isn't a very thick understory because not much sun gets down to this level. Then there's a lower canopy, an upper canopy, and then there's the emergent layer. The emergent layer is where most of the bright light is. So that's kind of where those trees are fighting to get to. And then as we go down to the forest floor, it gets darker and darker. So this is just a picture from the floor of a tropical rainforest, and I find it interesting that only 3 to 15% of the sun's rays actually penetrate to the floor of a tropical rainforest. Okay, now that we have gone through all of the forests, we're going to move on to what we call shrublands. And shrubs are basically plants with woody persistent stems. So remember, woody means secondary xylem is present. But they have no central trunk. They just have small, thick, evergreen leaves. They have lots of waxy cuticles, and they have underground roots that are like really thick. And so a chaparral is a type of shrubland that lacks any understory, and the ground litter is highly flammable. So we've talked before about how certain plants, like our longleaf pine here in the eastern part of North Carolina, requires fire to open their seeds. Well, that is also true of many of the shrubs in a chaparral. And a chaparral is a type of shrubland, so we're focusing on that. Okay, so this is our shrubland distribution. And so shrublands are very hot and very dry. So one thing you might notice is that this section right here, pretty much shaped like California. So that should give you a hint. Lots of California is covered in shrubland. So here we are. This is for your chart. And I specifically picked the Hollywood sign photo because if you look at the surrounding ground, you'll notice that this is all shrubland, or chaparral, which is a specific type of shrubland. And so it's usually in a temperate zone near a coastal area. So average temperature. The precipitation is fairly low. Warm summers, mild winters. The growing season is still year-round, and it tends to have very poor soil. It's got a fair amount of biodiversity, not huge, but fair. And plants are adapted to fire, because we said that happens often in these areas. And animals usually have quite a bit of camouflage features, because if you don't have a lot of cover from trees, then you need to be able to hide yourself well. So what causes California wildfires? Because we do hear about it a lot, right? So I just wanted you to take a look at some of these maps and where the fires have been located and the types of biomes that we see. So we start with our chaparral. Let's start there. I'm sorry, let me find my pointer. Okay. So the chaparral on the image to the right is in yellow. So we have that here. We have that all down here. And so often we have lightning-induced, unfortunately sometimes human-induced, fires. And when that occurs, that's fine in the chaparral because that's what it's adapted for. And the leaf litter in a chaparral tends to be very flammable. But our problem comes when we have all these winds. On the left they're marked as the Diablo winds or the Santa Ana winds. And particularly up in the northern part of California, that means if there is a chaparral up here that's on fire and the winds blow that this way, it blows into our coniferous forest. And if you'll remember, conifers tend to have a lot of resin in their bark as well as in their needles, and they aren't burn resistant, so they become highly flammable. So those two biomes close together can cause a almost an out of control type of fire. So that's something to be thinking about next time you hear about California wildfires. You can say, oh, I know why that happens. Okay, here are some of the animals that are present in our chaparral. The mule deer, our western fence lizard, which just looks really cool to me, and then roadrunner. If you ever watched Roadrunner and the Coyote, this is a real roadrunner. Okay, we're going to move on to grassland biomes. I think grasslands are beautiful. We have it in the Midwest, in the plains of the U.S. And they kind of come in two different types. There's either the temperate grasslands or savannas. So I thought this was a fascinating statistic that I did not know prior to doing research, and that is that the grasslands cover a quarter of all land on Earth. That's a lot. I tend to think of forests covering, most of it, which, it may, but a quarter of all land on Earth is covered by grasslands. So that's pretty fascinating to me. So here is the distribution of where grasslands are within the world. And note the influence of latitude in the distribution of temperate versus savanna grasslands. So if we look at, sorry, I'm trying to find my little pointer. So the savanna grasslands are right across here. And that's also called our tropical grasslands. So they're near the equator. And then almost equal distribution above and below the equator are the temperate grasslands. And remember, we said temperate is sort of like average temperature. So not super hot, not super cold. So our temperate grasslands, when we look at the plants, they tend to form dense sod type grasses, or what we call bunch grasses. And the grasses can withstand frequent fires. This should be sounding familiar. The chaparral can, and our temperate grasslands can, and that's often because we tend to have naturally occurring fires in these areas due to lightning. The animals, we have pretty much everything you might expect: insects, mammals, birds, reptiles. Large animals tend to be migratory and grazing. And then of course there's burrowing animals. So these are in the plains of the Midwest. Oftentimes, the way I picture this the best is because I read Little House on the Prairie series when I was little, so thank you, Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is my image of the plains of the Midwest. Okay, so this is just to show you some of the grasses that are present, because I won't expect you to do this, but temperate grasslands usually are further classified as either short grass, mixed grass, or tall grass prairies, and that's based mostly on the amount of rainfall that each of the grassland gets. So here we go. These are some of the animals that are often present in grasslands. We have our American bison, prairie dogs, coyotes, antelope. By the way, we do not have buffalo. Buffalo is an Asian animal. We have bison, just so you know. So here are just a few more animals for you to kind of associate with those grasslands. Grasshoppers, which tend to be a pest if there's too many of them. Sheep, of course, and yaks, which I think are cool. So often these open grasslands are used for grazing animals. Cattle drives used to be used to bring large amounts of cows into prairies of the Midwest. That was prior to barbed wire fencing, by the way. So I'm going to take a moment to plug a movie recommendation, or it's actually like a mini-series. Lonesome Dove is a wonderful book and mini-series, but it kind of shows you all about the Midwestern U.S. prior to barbed wire fencing. Okay, the next type of grassland is the savanna grassland, so the one located near the equator. It has a fair amount of rainfall, but it's all concentrated in the wet season. So this is the type that has a wet and dry season. So all of the growth occurs during the wet or rainy season. So the soil is rich in the moist areas, but poor in the dry areas. So it's very compartmentalized. And the species diversity is moderate. Less than a rainforest, but more and less than a deciduous forest as well. So again, just bringing you back to where the savannas are located, near the equator. And for the savanna grasslands, the plant adaptations are, they have runners, they have vertical leaves, they have thorns, and they drop leaves during the dry season to conserve that energy. The trees that are present are often fire resistant and drought resistant. They offer food for giraffes, so they can grow tall because of their rapid growth rate, and that occurs during the rainy season. So the animals that are present, of course, insects, mammals, and birds, and then the grazing animals are migratory, and that's usually what dominates these particular grasslands. Many of the rodents that are present often burrow, but because of their presence, there's also birds of prey that are present in the savanna grasslands as well. So here we go. These are some of the animals that we associate with the savanna grasslands. Thinking circle of life here from Disney. That usually will put you into what is present in the savanna grasslands. Okay, now we're going to move on to deserts. And deserts come in two varieties. There's the cold desert and the hot desert. So cold deserts are usually located between 30 and 60 degrees north and south, whereas hot deserts are located between 0 and 30 degrees north and south. So that latitude taking effect. And deserts are characterized by small amounts of precipitation. I know that's no shock to you. This image is a hot desert. This is the Sahara Desert. And here is a cold desert, the Himalayan desert in the Nubra Valley in India. So here's all the information for your chart. Just note that there's a huge temperature swing in deserts between day and night. You can have very hot days and very cold nights. So people who hike or camp there know that it's actually a very harsh environment, even regardless of the lack of water. Okay, so when we're looking here at the distribution throughout the world of our deserts, you definitely see the effect of latitude, but we also have altitude-based deserts as well. So cold deserts can be called high deserts or temperate deserts, and they are based on altitude, so high elevation with low precipitation. In the desert, we have very few plants, but when we do, they're typically what we call succulents. Succulents are plants that have very thick, fleshy leaves and very thick cuticles that retain water. They have shallow, widespread roots, and their growth cycle is super quick. And it tends to remain dormant until water is present. And our animal adaptations are very thick-skinned animals or even scales. Animals tend to either be nocturnal or what we call, they either are nocturnal or they practice what we call evastating. Evastating just means that they burrow during the hottest part of the day. So think about they take a siesta during the hottest part so that they're not exposed to that really hot temperature. So here are some of the animals that are present in deserts. The desert fox, which if you notice it has these huge ears, so it can sense either predators or prey. The Gila monster, it definitely has very thick scales. Our kangaroo rat, which is of course nocturnal, and the Arctic fox down here lives in the desert, and it does change its color coat depending on the season. And then of course our typical desert animal, the camel. So just so you know details, camels can stop at an oasis for water and food, and they can drink up to 100 liters at one time, which is crazy amounts of water. But here's the deal. It cannot store water in its hump. That is a myth. That big hump right there is just fat storage. So there you go. Now you can destroy somebody else's idea with that. So we've talked about how deserts can be based on altitude or latitude. But I also wanted to mention that deserts can be created by what we call the rain shadow effect. And I have linked an extra video for you guys to see if you want to take a look at that in a little more detail. But essentially what that means is that there is a mountain area that causes moist air coming off of the ocean to come, and as soon as it hits the mountains, then the water is released from those clouds, and so that means that everything after it is very dry air. So that's what we call the rain shadow effect, and that happens on the leeward side of a mountain, and that's the case in California and Nevada. That's how Death Valley is formed. So here you can see the distribution of the biomes and link that to the amount of temperature and rainfall that happens, and you can see the distribution worldwide for that. So what about the polar regions? The polar regions really haven't been named as a biome, typically because there's not plant life there to really name it for. And the polar regions, those biomes are both terrestrial and aquatic. And what I mean by that is that the terrestrial and aquatic sections of them are inseparable. The ice constantly melts and refreezes, and those animals that are present tend to live in both the water and the land. So it's not particularly a terrestrial biome or an aquatic biome either. So we find these polar regions in Greenland, the Arctic, and Antarctica. So there are no plants present because mostly if there's soil, it's completely frozen. So all polar animals are super efficient at producing and retaining body heat. So let's take, for example, polar bears. Polar bears have white fur. The reason for that is because the shaft of that fur itself is actually hollow. No pigment in it. It is an air-filled shaft, which is the best insulator. So it warms up that air within that fur, and that maintains that heat for the polar bears. And so here's a fun fact for you. There are at least 17 different types of ice. And at least in Inuit cultures, there's like over 100 different words for the various different types of ice. So in those regions, there's very low species diversity as far as we know, but many of the glacial lakes have not been explored yet. So here are our polar animals. And I think, as you know, most of them have very high fat content. And most are migratory. So they don't live in the Arctic all year round, typically speaking. And just another thing for you to know, polar bears are present in the northern hemisphere, penguins are present in the southern hemisphere, and they do not cross over. So what about the top of Mount Everest? I told you I was fascinated with it. The top of Mount Everest is a completely unique environment. It lacks oxygen, and it is always frozen. No plant life and no animal life. It does get precipitation, and when it does, it usually happens all at once. very fast, lots and lots of water, usually in the form of snow. So here's just something interesting. The precipitation varies wildly and can be it can be extremely dry due to wind conditions, but can also dump large amounts of snow in a very short period of time. And then the temperature variation is enormous. So in January, it's a lot warmer. July is much colder. But even those that climb on Everest, they will tell you sometimes on the way up, because of the sunshine, the sun then reflects off of all that white snow, it can get very hot. It can be 90 degrees just because of all the reflected sunlight. So when you're hiking in a down outfit, you start taking it off because it's super hot. And then as soon as you get into the shade, it can drop. It can drop to like 20 or 15 degrees during the day and drop way below that at night. So at night, you're talking maybe minus 30 degrees. So there is a huge difference in temperature swings. Okay, let's talk about this. In normal weather patterns, just throughout the Earth, warm air roams slowly and will eventually collide with a cool, dry air mass, and that's how a storm is produced. On mountains, particularly those with a steep angle and extremely high altitude, like Everest, you typically have a warmer, heavier, moister weather hanging down near the base of the mountain. But nearby, like only a few miles away, you have a looming mass of lighter, cooler, drier atmosphere sitting right next door. So essentially, it only takes a small shift in wind to make these two collide and have a sudden, unexpected, violent storm arise. And that happens often on Everest. So you can see it coming right here. But this is why. That warm air mass coming up, the cooler air coming down, and like I said, this is only within a mile or so of each other. So very slight shifts in wind can cause these abrupt, violent storms. So this is one of the things that makes climbing Everest so difficult and challenging, because a lot of times it's very unpredictable, and because it's so violent, oftentimes there's whiteout conditions so you can't see anything, and heaven forbid that actually occur on a place where you're on the knife's edge. So anyway, so thank you for letting me talk a little bit about Everest. As we were talking about biomes, I just wanted you to think about it, because the other thing that I didn't mention is on the top of Everest, there's no animals present, and often no bacteria, no fungi. So when you do have something that dies, it doesn't decay. Okay, that's where when we talk about people bringing bodies down from Everest that have been there for like 20 years, it's because there's no decay. Now, if some of it is exposed, there are a couple of birds actually that can go that high. So occasionally that does cause for some degrading, but no bacterial decay. So it's just a really interesting environment. Okay, that's enough about terrestrial biomes. Next time we're going to talk about some aquatic biomes and conservation.